additional actions need to be taken. And of course, any researcher, before starting conducting any research study, research project, should be in collaboration with the ethical committee of the respective institution or university. So now we talk about, first of all, about participant observation. Participant observation is where the researcher joins in the group being studied and observes their behavior. And this is related to what we call ethnographic method or ethnography. Ethnography is traditionally associated with anthropology. Why? Because anthropologists visit a foreign land, they have the chance to have access to a group and spend several years living with them with the aim of uncovering their culture. So what this method involves watching other participants to how they behave. We can listen to them, we can engage in conversations with them, and spend the whole day also with them. This is what we call ethnography. What are the strengths of participant observation? First of all, that we can observe what people do, not what they say they do. In contrast to most other methods, participant observation allows the researcher to see what people do rather than what people say they do. And of course, it's something which takes place in natural settings. This means that respondents act more naturally here than in a laboratory. Or during more formal interview. This means that the Hawthorne effect will be less, especially with the cohort research. We're going to explain all these things. Actually, what is Hawthorne effect? Hawthorne effect is when people act differently because they know they're being observed. This means that we should be aware of this. The other strength of participant observation has to do with how we can gain insights, how we can dig deeper, and of course, this allows researchers to fully join the group and see things through the eyes and actions of the people in group. So joining in allows the researcher to gain empathy through personal experiences. And at the same time, their flexibility in order to generate new ideas. Why? Because when we complete questionnaires, researchers begin with preset questions. By contrast here, participant observation is much more flexible because it allows the researcher to enter the situation with an open mind, and as new situations are encountered, they can be followed up. What are now the limitations of participant observation? There's a low degree of reliability. Why? Because the groups used in participant observation studies are usually unrepresentative because they are accessed through what we call snowball sampling. And they are haphazardly selected. What this means, snowball sampling is a technique in which research participants are asked to assist researchers in identifying other potential subjects. There is a low degree representative, as I said before, low degree of reliability, lack of objectivity and validity objectivity, because there is critics how valid participant observation really is, because some experts say that the method lacks objectivity. It can be very difficult for researchers to avoid subjectivity and forming biased views of the group being studied. And another threat to validity is what I mentioned before, the Hawthorne effect, because when people know that they're going to be interviewed, of course, they act differently. And the lack of concepts of social structures such as class, gender, or ethnicity. Very, very important. We talk about social science, and observation has to do with two types. First of all, is overt observation. This is where the group being studied know they are being observed. And on the other hand, we have covert observation. This where the group being studied does not know they're being observed, or what we say, we use the word undercover. They both have the strengths and limitations. Overt research is obviously more ethical because of the lack of what we call the lack of deception, and it allows the researcher to ask probing questions and use other research methods. And on the other hand, covert research is ideal, we could say, for cases if we want, for instance, to conduct research among deviant groups, such as, for instance, drug users or drug dealers or football hooligans. This group of people, we know that they will never give us informed consent for the research. So covert observation actually is justified for this because it helps us to gain a fuller immersion into the host culture, avoids the Hawthorne effect because the object of research, they don't know that they're object of research, they don't know that we conduct research, so we minimize the Hawthorne effect. But this covert observation has also limitations. We're going to see about this. So some advantages, first of all, of overt research is that we can ask probing questions, we can combine it with other methods, we can take on the role of what we call professional strangers. Respondents might tell you things because they know you are not, as we say, one of them. It is less stressful and risky for the researcher and easier to do follow-up studies. These are the advantages of overt observation. Now, we talk about covert observation, mention that it's important if we want to conduct difficult research among groups like drug users, drug dealers, or football hooligans. And it is, however, questionable whether or not it is ethical for social science research scholars to covert research. Because I mentioned before, it is, of course, impossible to ask for informed consent for members of such communities because they do not want to be investigated. And the act of seeking informed consent from some research participants, of course, can sometimes lead to a change in the attitude of the research participant towards giving information to the researchers. And other experts have argued against the covert research, stating that it is unnecessary in social research, that the covert research may have a negative impact on researchers, that as long as the respondents trust, we could say, the researcher, there is no need to conduct covert research. So another disadvantage is that, of course, invades the privacy of the respondent. And this is considered sometimes as unethical. So the problem is that here, as a disadvantage of covert participant observation, the problem of taking field notes, you can use other methods. If you are in a covert role, you have to act as the natives too, without raising suspicion. So you have to be very careful for this. It's more stressful and there are ethical problems because, as I said before, covert research does not allow for participants to give informed consent because it involves what we call deception. And there is also the issue of privacy being violated, the fact that some researchers may have to engage in criminal acts in order to conduct new research and cover this. So again, there's another question. Should a researcher report something like that? If someone is engaged in criminal action, should report this to police or leave it and conduct the research? There are some ethical dilemmas. And I want to say here that throughout your research journey, you're going to face a lot of ethical dilemmas like this. And of course, the ethical code of, this is regulated by ethical committees is important, but sometimes it's not sufficient. So beyond ethical codes, as I always say, we need to put on priority what we call ethical values. And another issue, we talk about participant observers, has to do with neutrality, because the researchers should be neutral in order to maintain the aim of subjectivity. Some experts say that a closer relationship between researchers and participants of this kind can lead to conflict and deception. And this way, it is more difficult to make objective judgments if they are personally connected with the respondents. So, ethics committees ask for special consideration is another case for vulnerable groups because these groups usually have difficulties in providing initial and continued informed consent to conduct research. So, informed consent is the first one thing when we start research about social sciences, discovers a range of procedures that must be implemented when our study includes human subjects. And this is usually accompanied by informed consent letter. This letter should be detailed enough so that the participant is informed about the specific nature of the project, including any potential risks, and the letter should outline how participation will make a contribution to the project goals. So we should make sure that participants can follow up, of course, with any questions or concerns that they may have about our project by providing them with information on whom we should contact about the study. So you make sure that study participants know that their agreement is to participate is completely voluntary and that they are free to opt out of your study before, during, and or after the initial participation. So if we talk about this, the principle of voluntary participation requires that people should not be forced into participating in research. Another thing that the process of gathering information from respondents requires informed consent, I mentioned before, which means that prospective research participants must be fully informed about the procedures and risks involved in research and must give their consent to participate. And furthermore, ethical standards also require that researchers not put participants in a potentially harmful situation. Harm can be either physical or psychological. So these things that need to take into consideration. So there are ethical dilemmas, and all these practices of ethics can be very complex and many times before pose fundamental ethical questions that researchers must navigate, often without having a clear guidance from anyone. So on the other hand, I mentioned before about the case of covert research and how this entails what we call deception. Some researchers argue that the research must be conducted in a covert manner to maintain obtain observation I mentioned before. These are the proponents of covert research. And we said about we can ask some questions that is it ethical to go undercover to study, for instance, one organization? What does the researcher do when or she confronts information or situations where individuals are observed engaging in major violations of the law? Or is the researcher ethically obligated to report such activity? What about the risks the researcher is taking in terms of his or her own life in doing so? The form letter I said before, and there is some other questions. To what extent can we verify the validity or accuracy of information? Should researchers inform individuals of their inclusion in research? Of course, I mentioned before. Is it acceptable to use social networking sites? Is another big issue. How does someone establish a definition for consent to working with this information? So when we talk about social software and social media, is another big issue because here we have the case, for instance, of social media. For example, you want to conduct research on social media and using the profiles, the data of the profiles of some, that would be some teenagers, for example. This information is publicly displayed on social media. Of course, it's public, but it contains private information. So again, there is a problem. Is it ethical or unethical to use this data? Can you use the data for a valid study? How do you ensure that its accuracy? For example, many teenagers use fake age on their profiles. Is this a privacy violation? Also another question. All this to our big question: how does a researcher conduct ethical research, and how does a researcher distinguish between public information, private information? This is one thing we talk about social media, and at the same time, you need to pose these questions about your own research. What are your ethical standpoints on the research process? What type of ethical principles guide your work and life beyond the professional code of ethics that you are bound by through a given professional association? And where do your ethical obligations to the research start and end? So knowing your own ethical standpoint as a researcher is a very important internal guide as to how you can proceed in your research. Very interesting, this checklist of patterns, questions of conducting an ethical research project. Some questions about, for example, who will have access to this data, for what purposes, in what ways we will conduct this research. If we put respondents at risk, why should the researchers participate in this project? Questions like this. A very interesting example, you know, from the history, it's anyone who studies social sciences is very aware of this, Milgram's experiment. It was an experiment from in 1963. It was a research project concerning obedience to authority. Milgram wanted to understand the conditions under which individuals obey authority figures. But it was actually a project which contained deception because the volunteers didn't know about this. They thought that it was an experiment. They were teachers, actually, the subject of research. They thought that the experiment had to do with punishment and memory. So it was a very debatable experiment here. You can see what's happening. The experimenter orders the teacher, the subject of the experiment, to give what the teacher believes are painful electric shocks to learner who is actually an actor and confederate. So what is happening here? The subject is led to believe that for each wrong answer, the learner was receiving actual electric shock, but in reality, there was no such a punishment. So it was a deception, this experiment. This is the most common example. We talk about ethical dilemmas and social sciences. Usually, we mention this case of Milgram experiment. So, how can I observe my ethical values in my research practice? As I said before, ethical guidelines usually are not sufficient and cannot cover all the ethical dilemmas that we may face in the practice of social research. We cannot achieve ethical research by following a set of pre-established procedures that are or will always be correct. And what are the forbidden processes in the context of social research? First of all, when we exert undue pressure to a subject to participate, I said before, this should be voluntarily. When there is deception, misleading the subject on what the study is all about, when there is invasion of privacy or intrusion into matters that the subject would rather keep to himself or herself, when there is a breach of confidentiality, when there is stress or psychological difficulties, and where there is a collective injury or risks and harms that the study might cause to others. So all these are the forbidden processes if we talk about the conduct of social researches. Another case about ethics here is when researchers collaborate with sponsors, because sometimes social research is dependent on the state funding, but at the time there will be a private also interest. So we need to protect researchers from sponsors' pressures and respect their autonomy. Nowadays we talk about big data and social science research, for this way there is a very nice framework which is developed by David Resnick. It's called Ethics of Science, and this framework consists of 12 main principles: honesty, carefulness, openness, freedom, credit, education, social responsibility, legality, opportunity, mutual respect, efficiency, and respect from others. So this framework allows us actually to make distinction between two kinds of bias. The first one, biases that might be included in methodologies and techniques used in research projects, what we call methodological biases. And the other type has to do with the personal values and worldviews and preferences of researchers. So all these principles contained in this framework is very complete. All they have to do with respect for subject, with social responsibility. So with recent development in big data technologies have opened new possibilities for social scientists and new possibilities in order to handle prejudice and biases. Also, we know that to articulate some of these biases, we use self-tracking and crowdsourcing platforms as examples, also in order to help researchers to adhere with principles of honesty and carefulness. Before concluding, with the same example of the National Committee for Research Ethics in Social Science and Humanities is a great example. Here you can see some principles about free independent research, academic assessment, co-authorship, international collaboration, confidentiality, transparency about roles and responsibilities, dependence in research. As I said before, we may have sponsors by state or private factor, but we should remain autonomous in our ideas, in our perception, in our worldviews. Publication ethics, dissemination as institutional responsibility, and participation in public debate. So thank you very much for your attention. It's a very interesting topic, and if you have any questions, I would love to discuss. Usually when I present this, they pose many questions, so I'm open to discussion.
Thank you.
Actually, nobody can answer if something ethical or unethical. There are dilemmas. That's why it's called dilemma. But there are questions that you need to have in mind when we start conducting a research.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And that was truly another incredible presentation. Please give the big hand to our Dr. RANIA LAMPU, Madam, for such an incredible presentation in this platform. Now the session is open for discussion. So here we go with our discussion session, and one after another, we will have here the comment by the academician. I would like to take the opportunity to unmute our Dr. Sukhvinder Singh, registered here in this platform, so that you can share your comment regarding the presentation of our Dr. RANIA LAMPU, Madam, for this.
Thank you so much, sir, for meeting me. And as always, very warm welcome to RANIA LAMPU, Madam, from Greece. Excellent presentation. The topic that today ma'am has selected in our international conference is one of, I feel, the best one, because in the challenges of social sciences research, ma'am has highlighted the various, from the sampling part to the entire research methods and methodology ma'am has described. And one thing I like that ma'am has discussed also one very important aspects, that when you are under observation, your behavior changes, your discussions are somehow not organic in that nature, which is a big challenge in social science research. The qualitative research is depending upon the feeling and, of course, the experiences, which can be manipulative in terms of the environment. So this is an excellent challenge that ma'am has discussed, and I have learned this thing today. So thank you so much, ma'am, for making us learn this new things. And as always, an absolute champion presentation in our ICORM 3.0. Thank you so much, ma'am, for presenting this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for such a wonderful discussion. I would like to take the opportunity to unmute our Professor Dr. Rajesh Kandur, sir, in this platform to add his comment. I think that our Kandur, sir, is facing maybe discuss issue. Oh, okay, he unmuted. Sorry, I think to say the internet because I think the voice is breaking and we are not getting the clear audio. And now this is time to have the message from the keynote speaker. Yes, this message will encourage researcher and academician to do more research in this field. Over to you, Madam, And we are eagerly waiting for your message.
Yes, yes. First, I would like to thank you for this wonderful opportunity you gave me today to share my thoughts. Very sensitive when we talk about ethical considerations. I'm reviewing many journals, and I have seen nowadays what is happening with papers which are submitted and they are copy-paste of ChatGPT. It's very disappointing. And that's why I've started to present a lot about ethical considerations, because it's the only way to remain our academic integrity and how to become responsible researchers. So especially we talk about technology, artificial intelligence. My message for the scholars who I'm certain that they use ChatGPT is that ChatGPT needs to be cited. And for instance, if you have, if you take you can create an appendix, for example, or a separate part where you should make a full citation, because the question that ChatGPT gives is unique. It cannot be retrievable. So you need to take the whole part, paste it, and you should mention in your research paper that you have used AI generative tools. It is important. Of course, every journal has its own rules for this, but the trend nowadays is that we need to mention what are the tools, AI tools that we use. Because this has to do with the ethics, the ethical guidelines. Otherwise, your paper will be rejected. This is certain. So this was my message about this, and I hope that this inspired our scholars and be aware of all these challenges when we talk about ethical issues and ethical considerations.
Thank you. Thank you very much, madam. And that was truly incredible presentation. And I think that starting with the technical research and each and everything wonderfully explained here. And I hope that the young researcher will find out that it is more and more valuable to start their research. So may I request everyone to give the big hand to RANIA LAMPU madam here. And I hope that in future also we will have the more and more presentation from your side. Thank you very much, madam, for your time, for your contribution, and for your passion to change the world. Thank you. Thank you very much. And namaste from our side.